Imagine spending your entire life believing that you know exactly who destroyed your family, living each day with a burning desire for revenge, shaping your identity around pain, only to discover at the most decisive moment that everything you believed was a lie. It sounds like a scene from a movie, right? But this story, the story of Ethan and Lucas, goes far beyond fiction. It is a real drama with psychological suspense, devastating revelations, and a truth that has the power to change not only the course of events, but who you are inside. They were not villains. They were victims of silence, omission, and stories told halfway. For years, these two brothers carried on their shoulders a mission that they believed was noble: to take justice into their own hands. But justice and revenge do not always go hand in hand. And when the truth came out, unexpected, raw, painful, what happened was not just a turning point. It was an emotional revolution. A catharsis so intense that it forced both of them to reinvent themselves. Because sometimes the greatest enemy is not the one we point out. It's the feeling that guides us to it. Get ready for a story that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. That will shake your certainties, make you question how far you would go for loyalty, for pain, for justice. A story about the price of not knowing the truth, and about the transformative power of finding it, even when it hurts. But I warn you, what begins as a plan for revenge ends as one of the greatest examples of overcoming, forgiveness, and reconnecting with one's own humanity. Are you ready? Because after hearing this, you will never look at pain the same way again. It was a rainy night in Portland when brothers Ethan and Lucas' world collapsed silently. As children, they watched from afar as the flames consumed the house where they lived with their parents. The sirens cut through the air, but they arrived too late. All that was left was rubble, broken memories, and an emptiness that echoed in their chests. The official report indicated an accidental fire, but an anonymous complaint put a name in evidence: Raymond Foster, his father's former partner, involved in unresolved business disputes. And it was with this version of events that they grew up, feeding on sadness, loneliness, and a silent desire for justice. Ethan, the oldest, took on the role of protector. Lucas, more introspective, clung to the hope that one day they would find peace, but poorly explained pain hardens the heart. And without them realizing it, that episode planted the seeds of revenge, disguised on purpose. Years passed. Childhood became a blurred memory, but the wound remained open. Ethan became a pragmatic man, with a firm voice and eyes that did not allow emotional invasion. Lucas, on the other hand, followed a different rhythm, silent, observant, still trying to understand the reasons. The lack of answers about that tragedy shaped their choices, affected friendships, and shaped their relationship with the world. They learned about injustice early on, but they did not have the space to experience forgiveness. Without the support of a complete truth, what remained was a narrative of pain, marked by insecurity and repressed anger. Each anniversary of their parents' deaths was a cruel reminder. Each new injustice they witnessed reignited their desire to see Raymond pay. It wasn't just about revenge. It was what gave meaning to their unresolved pain. It was what held them together. And over time, that mission became more than a plan. It became their identity. Growing up with the idea that someone destroyed your family is not something you simply get over. It is a silent journey, where resilience mixes with bitterness, and where the search for answers is, in fact, a search for internal reconciliation. Ethan and Lucas did not know this. They were immersed in a linear narrative, where there was a clear villain and two orphans in search of justice. They did not have access to the emotional wisdom that would allow them to question their own pain. The world, for them, was divided between the guilty and the innocent. There was no room for nuances, nor for understanding. All they wanted was the chance to look Raymond in the eyes and make him feel a little of what they had experienced. Not out of sadism, but because they believed that this was the only way to free themselves. What they did not yet know is that the truth has the power to heal or destroy. And when it finally appears, it does not always bring what we expected. Time did not erase the pain. It only taught the brothers to hide it better. Ethan and Lucas grew up with anger dormant, but always present, like a volcano waiting for the right eruption. As adults, with access to technology, contacts, and experience, they decided they would no longer wait for justice from others. It was time to act. They used social media, public records, and databases to locate Raymond Foster, who now lived alone in a quiet town in the interior of Colorado. An invisible man, forgotten by everyone except them. The plan began to take shape with coldness and precision. Infiltrate his life, gain his trust, discover his weaknesses, and at the right moment, confront him, make him pay. The pain that had previously seemed unbearable now gave way to adrenaline. Their initiative seemed, in their eyes, an act of justice. But when revenge dresses up as reason, it becomes even more dangerous. Ethan was the brains of the operation. He put together dossiers, analyzed routines, studied routes. His intelligence was sharp, but fueled by a corrosive motivation. Lucas, more hesitant, followed his brother out of loyalty and because he also wanted answers. It wasn't blood they were after. It was confession. It was the understanding they never had. They created false identities, introduced themselves as volunteers for an NGO that cared for lonely elderly people, all with the appearance of kindness but full of intention. The closer they got to the day of their reunion, the more their feelings mixed. Ethan dreamed of the moment when he would see Raymond begging for forgiveness. Lucas, he didn't know exactly what he expected. He just felt that, unlike his brother, he couldn't ignore the humanity of the mission. It was as if deep down, a voice was telling him that they were treading on thin ice. But once it began, the plan seemed to take on a life of its own. The anger accumulated over the years worked as fuel, but also as poison. Ethan no longer spoke of reconstruction or peace. His narrative was of punishment, of an eye for an eye. Lucas tried to argue, but the force of their shared pain was too great. It wasn't just what they had lost. It was what they had never been able to live. A peaceful youth, a stable family, a chance to simply exist without the weight of tragedy. And so the two of them moved forward, determined, focused, but also blind. They didn't know that by trying to destroy someone, they were getting further and further away from what they were really looking for, their own cure. And they were about to discover that not every plan survives the first contact with reality. Because sometimes, the truth comes into play with such force that it doesn't just change the course. It changes who you are. The day arrived like any other, clear skies, light wind, and apparent tranquility that clashed with the turmoil inside the brothers. Ethan and Lucas were ready. They had already contacted Raymond by phone, presented the proposal of the fictitious NGO, and scheduled the first visit. When they arrived at the house, they came across something unexpected. A modest, well-kept residence, with flowers at the entrance and the low sound of old music coming from inside. Raymond greeted them with a shy smile, slow steps, and eyes that carried the weight of years. He was a man with a calm voice, halting speech, and a kind of kindness that was disarming. Ethan stood firm, analyzing each gesture coldly. Lucas, on the other hand, remained silent, overcome by a disconcerting feeling. The figure before them did not fit the image of the villain they had nurtured for so long. And this dissonance was the first sign that something was off script. In the following meetings, The brothers took turns visiting, pretending to be interested in helping with small tasks. Raymond was welcoming, always polite, but never invasive. He spoke little about the past and avoided mentioning his family. But there was a contained pain in his eyes, as if he carried an old guilt, one that he may never have verbalized. Lucas, increasingly sensitive to his surroundings, began to notice details. An old framed photo on the fireplace, with their father next to Raymond, smiling. A photo frame with a picture of their mother, still young. It was as if the past they were trying to bury was there, alive, present, waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan interpreted it as emotional manipulation. But Lucas felt something different. There was more than regret there. There was affection. There was humanity. And this began to erode the wall of certainties they had built throughout their lives. The visits began to be accompanied by long silences and thoughtful looks. Raymond, despite his fragility, offered coffee, listened attentively, asked simple questions about their lives. He never suspected, or if he did, he never showed it. Lucas began to wonder, what if they were wrong? What if they had spent years harboring hatred for a man who had perhaps also suffered? Doubt crept in, like a crack in a previously solid wall. Ethan, noticing his brother's hesitation, tightened his speech even more. He's manipulating. That's what they do. But Lucas was no longer so sure. Because the truth, when it comes close, begins to touch the heart first. And what they still didn't know is that in the basement of that house, a letter was waiting silently. To change everything, Lucas began to collect concerns. With each visit, he left Raymond's house with more questions than answers. He noticed small gestures that seemed too spontaneous to be part of a disguise. The care taken with his deceased wife's flowers in the garden, the old books marked with emotional notes, and the recipes taped to the kitchen cabinet. There were signs there of an ordinary life, of a man who, despite his losses, cultivated some form of hope in his daily life. Lucas couldn't explain it, but there was something deeply human about Raymond, a kindness without pose, a kind of affection that couldn't be rehearsed. Ethan, on the other hand, viewed everything with skepticism. He said it was all a show. But Lucas could no longer see a villain there. He saw a lonely old man, with longing in his eyes and scars on his heart. And this realization tore him apart. Inside, during one of his visits, Lucas found a photo album on top of a bookshelf. He leafed through it carefully and, to his surprise, saw pictures of his own parents, of old parties, of family trips. They weren't distant or casual photos. They were intimate records of genuine friendship that hit him hard. It was like discovering that his supposed enemy mourned the same dead as he did. He returned home in silence, unable to look his brother in the eye. Ethan, noticing his uneasiness, reacted harshly. "You're forgetting what he did." But Lucas wasn't forgetting. He was feeling it. And when the heart begins to doubt, the whole body trembles. He spent the night awake, reviewing all the memories, trying to find meaning between the pain he had always believed was just and the new possibility that was emerging. That maybe, just maybe, they had missed the target of his fury. This ambiguity led him to act more cautiously. During his subsequent visits, Lucas began to observe Raymond with different eyes, looking for flaws, contradictions, but finding humanity. The anger that had previously guided his steps now gave way to wavering trust. To doubt that, paradoxically, also brought relief, because hating is tiring. And Lucas was tired of carrying that weight. He began to think about how they could investigate further, to understand what really happened. Maybe there was something hidden, something that had escaped in the rush to point fingers. And deep down, even without admitting it, he already knew that the truth was closer than ever. Because when the soul begins to open itself to wisdom, life tends to show signs, and the next one was there, hidden. In a letter forgotten for decades. It was on a cloudy afternoon that Lucas While helping Raymond organize old boxes in the basement, found something that would change the course of that story forever. Amidst faded albums, dusty books, and papers yellowed by time, he saw a small wooden box locked with a simple latch. Raymond didn't seem to know what it was. "My wife's things. I never went through them much," he said with a sad smile. Lucas, with permission, opened the box. Inside, among old letters, he found an envelope addressed to their mother, dated 3 days before the fire. His heart raced. His hands trembled. The paper, although fragile, was legible. It was a letter written by Raymond, and what it said was nothing like what they had expected. Here was the beginning of a truth suffocated by time and pain. The letter was long, handwritten, with traces of desperation. Raymond warned the brothers' mother about a real threat: their father's involvement with a businessman named Charles Green. According to him, Charles was involved in fraud, money laundering, and more seriously, he threatened to expose or destroy anyone who dared to leave the alliance. Raymond asked them to stay away, to be careful, to report it while there was still time. He said that he had already tried to convince the boy's father, but that he was trapped in a web of debts and threats. The letter was, above all, a cry of warning, not an admission of guilt. And right then and there, Lucas knew that everything they had believed for years could be deeply wrong. The realization came like a punch in the gut. The letter was not a clue. It was a burst of reality, and with it came new questions, new names, new truths. With a heavy heart, Lucas showed the letter to Ethan that night. His brother read it in silence, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed. He finished and threw the paper on the table. It could be a lie. He could have written it later to clear his name. But Lucas no longer believed that. There was real pain in the words. There was insight, urgency, even a kind of protective love between the lines. And more than that, there was a new name, Charles Green, someone they had never heard of. What if Remand was telling the truth? What if the real culprit had been in the shadows all along, while they had been chasing the wrong man? Ethan resisted, clinging to his anger like someone clinging to a boat in the middle of a storm. But Lucas was already in another current, the search for truth, not revenge. And at that point, what was once just a plan for revenge became a journey for real justice. Driven by an impulse that mixed courage and the need for answers, Lucas delved into a parallel investigation. With the name Charles Green in hand, he began searching through public records, old forums, and local newspaper archives. And that was when the web began to unravel. He discovered that Charles had been an informal partner of their father in business involving pharmaceutical imports, a sector known for moving millions of dollars and for its gray area of regulation. But there was more. Lawsuits closed due to lack of evidence, anonymous complaints ignored, and a recurring suspicion that he had contacts with influential people within the police and politics. Each click was a piece fitting into a puzzle that previously seemed insoluble. And the more Lucas read, the more he realized that Raymond, far from being the enemy, was perhaps the only piece that tried to prevent what would happen. It was then that, in one of these archives, he found something irrefutable. A police report filed by Raymond days before the fire, reporting explicit threats from Charles Green. The document mentioned the house where his parents lived, mentioned the risk of retaliation if their business dealings fell apart, and requested protection. Nothing was done. The case was closed without investigation. Lucas took it to Ethan, hoping that reality would begin to penetrate his defenses, but his brother was divided. Part of him wanted to believe. The other, still stuck in the past, resisted. "What if this is all an act?" he murmured. It was. As if the truth, even when proven, still needed to face the ghosts of trauma. But somewhere inside Ethan, the structure was beginning to crack. Because emotional intelligence is not born ready, it is built in discomfort. And there, in the midst of doubt, he began to feel something new: doubt and fear of having made a mistake. So they decided to confront the last piece, a former employee of the company where their father and Charles worked, a retired accountant named Howard Beckett. He was reluctant, but agreed to talk after seeing the documents Lucas had gathered. What he told them was devastating. He confirmed that Charles was on the verge of being exposed for tax fraud, and that the boy's father wanted out of the scheme. He also said that on the night of the fire, he saw Charles acting suspiciously near the neighborhood, and that he had always believed he was involved in the tragedy, but he never had enough proof. That was when Ethan cried for the first time. Not just out of sadness, but out of guilt. The castle of certainties was crumbling, and the truth was finally imposing itself. They had spent their entire lives chasing the wrong man. And now, how could they go back? How could they do it all over again without tearing themselves apart in the process? The next step would be the hardest of all, facing their own emotional abyss. Ethan couldn't sleep. The images of the last few days danced in his mind like restless ghosts. His entire life had been built around one purpose: to punish the man who he believed had destroyed his family. Now, faced with the truth, that purpose crumbled like wet paper. He looked at himself in the mirror and no longer recognized his own reflection. What was left of him without that pain shaped over the years? Revenge, once his motivation, now seemed like poison to him. A black hole that consumed his empathy, his ability to see others as human. And when he realizes he is on the wrong side of history, the ground disappears. Pride kept him from crying, but his body trembled. Understanding was coming, but it was dragging chains. It hurt to accept that he was about to destroy an innocent person. Even more, that he had almost become the thing he hated most. Lucas, on the other hand, had already crossed the bridge of acceptance, but that didn't make things any easier. Quite the opposite. He felt complicit in something that hadn't happened yet, but that had come too close. He suffered when he thought about the times when, out of loyalty to his brother, he had stopped listening to his own heart. He, who had always believed in kindness, had almost allowed anger to suffocate his humanity. The crisis was deep. He spent sleepless nights, writing in old notebooks, trying to understand where they had gone astray. It wasn't about the fire anymore. It was about themselves. About what hatred had done to their souls. About how they had distanced themselves from what really mattered: the memory of their parents, the innocence of childhood, brotherly love. Lucas understood with silent tears that forgiving Raymond was only part of the process. They needed to forgive each other too, and that would be the hardest battle. The conflict between the brothers reached its peak in a fierce argument, full of accusations, silences, and broken looks. Ethan screamed. Lucas asked for calm. Until Ethan exploded. If this is all true, then my whole life has been a lie. And at that moment, the weight of the truth fell upon them both with all its density. Because yes, their lives had been shaped by a distorted narrative. But here was the chance to change. To use this truth not as a stone of condemnation, but as a seed of reconciliation. Lucas reached out his hand, asking them to face this together. Ethan, little by little, began to give in. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel without having to react. They cried like they had never done before. The pain did not go away, but it gave way to courage. And the next day, they decided that they needed to hear the whole truth, no matter what the cost. It was time to seek definitive answers about what really happened that night. The search for the truth led the brothers to a name that had been forgotten by official records, but not by the memory of an old retired firefighter named Frank Dawson. He had responded to the fire that fateful night, and after much insistence, he agreed to talk to Ethan and Lucas, sitting in his rocking chair. His eyes full of the marks of time and life, Frank recounted what he had seen. He remembered a car parked 2 blocks from the house, with a nervous man at the wheel, a description that matched Charles Green. He also said that, when he arrived at the scene, the fire was already in an advanced stage and that an unusual explosion had accelerated the destruction, something unusual in residential fires. But what had struck him most was the feeling that it was no accident. Frank had raised suspicions at the time, but had been silenced. It was the first time he had spoken about it openly, and his words sealed the revelation, along with the old records. Lucas found a copy of a technical report that had been ignored at the time. Chemical residues used as combustion accelerators. The evidence pointed directly to sabotage. Ethan, now with an open heart, read everything with different eyes. His indignation was no longer directed at Raymond, but at the negligence of the system, at the silent corruption that had allowed Charles Green to escape. The pieces were finally falling into place, and the picture was grim. Raymond, who tried to warn, was silenced. His parents, victims of a criminal web, were erased from history as just another statistical number. And the children, grew up in the darkness of a convenient lie. The pain was deep, yes, but along with it came something new: freedom. The truth freed them from the weight of illusion, from the prison of hatred, and gave them the chance to start over with emotional intelligence, wisdom, and above all, dignity. They returned home in silence, with the evidence in their hands and their hearts wounded but aware. Ethan held the documents as if holding a mirror, and saw in them the reflection of everything they had lost and everything they could still rebuild. Lucas thought about Raymond, about the injustice of so many years in silence, and about how much they needed to face the next step with humility. The truth, after all, does not only bring relief, it also demands. It demands maturity, empathy, and the courage to face oneself. But at that moment, despite everything, there was also a feeling of gratitude. Gratitude for not having passed the point of no return, for still having the chance to change the narrative before it was too late. And although they knew that the road to reconciliation would be long, there was something in their eyes that had not existed for years: hope. And now, they needed to do something with it. They needed to find Raymond and tell the truth. Raymond welcomed them as always, calmly, with a slight smile on his face and cups of tea already prepared. But that afternoon, the brothers were different. There was a weight on his shoulders, a solemnity in his gestures, and a silence that said more than any words. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice faltered, but he insisted. He told everything from the revenge plan to the discovery of the letter, the investigations, and the revelation about Charles Green. Lucas, at his side, filled in the details, with discreet tears streaming down his face. Raymond listened without interrupting, only nodding from time to time. His teary eyes revealed an old pain being reopened, but also a kind of relief at finally hearing the truth. When the brothers asked for forgiveness, they did not use ready-made phrases. They were sincere, human, disarmed. And in that moment, time stood still. Raymond remained silent for a few minutes. He breathed deeply, his eyes fixed on a frame on the shelf, an old photo of Ethan and Lucas's parents. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "You don't know how many times I've dreamed of this day. Not because of the confession, but because of the possibility of looking into your eyes and saying, 'I never meant any harm.'" There was no anger in his words. There was sadness. There was humanity. He said that he spent years trying to forget, that he cried in secret every time he looked at the photos, and that he lived under the shadow of a guilt that didn't belong to him. But even so, He forgave them. Not because he forgot, but because he understood. He understood that hate consumes, that pain distorts, and that the power of kindness, no matter how difficult it may be, is the only one capable of breaking this cycle of destruction. Ethan burst into tears. Lucas hugged him. And for a few minutes, the silence of that room was filled with something rare, the moving beauty of reconciliation. They left there changed. Not because they had been forgiven, but because they had finally allowed themselves to see beyond the pain. They now understood that forgiveness does not erase the past, but opens space for a new future. Raymond, even though fragile, was a symbol of resilience and generosity, someone who, despite the scars, chose not to return hate with hate. That left a deep impression on them. As they walked back, the brothers exchanged few words. It was unnecessary. Everything had been said. The pain was still there, it was true, but it had lost its hold. And in place of the guilt, a new mission was born, to transform all that into something greater, into something that could inspire others not to follow the same tortuous path. Because sometimes, true courage lies in admitting that you were wrong, and true strength in doing something with that truth. And that was exactly what they decided to do. The decision came one cold morning, as Ethan and Lucas walked through a park near Raymond's new home, where he now lived with the support of a small local community. There, amidst the bare trees of winter and the sound of children playing in the distance, the brothers understood that they could not simply move on as if nothing had happened. They carried a legacy not of the pain they had experienced, but of the truth they had discovered. So they decided to found an organization dedicated to supporting victims of unjust accusations and families who, like them, had been torn apart by lies. They named the foundation after their mother's last name, in honor of her gentleness and firmness. It was the beginning of a journey based on understanding, justice, and the commitment to transform suffering into solutions. Soon, they began giving lectures at schools, universities, and community forums. They spoke about the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and the courage to question the narratives we are taught. In one of these lectures, Ethan looked at the audience and said, "If someone had asked me years ago what justice was, I would have answered with anger. Today I say, justice is when the truth has a voice, and our mission is to amplify it." People listened attentively, some with tears in their eyes, others with the hope that their own stories could also change. Raymond watched one of these lectures online and at the end sent a simple message: "I am proud of you." That sealed the cycle. Redemption did not come as a prize, but as a process made up of small attitudes, conscious choices, a journey marked by honesty and emotional intelligence. Today, Ethan and Lucas are known not for the tragedy they experienced, but for the way they transformed that tragedy into something greater. They have become references in dialogue, reconciliation, and resilience. In the Foundation's hallways, there's a phrase printed on the wall: "Sometimes, what looks like justice is just poorly disguised anger." The phrase makes an impact, but it also provokes reflection. Because the true legacy of their story is this: to show that love, even when wounded, can still build. That truth, however painful it may be, is always the best path. And that pain, when well received, can become strength, can become a bridge. There is no magic formula, no shortcut, but there is a choice. And they chose life, humanity, kindness, the possibility of a world where forgiveness is not weakness, but rather the most powerful way to overcome. Now tell me, how many times have you caught yourself harboring anger without even being sure if it was fair? How many stories do you carry inside that perhaps have only been half told? The truth is that, many times, We live driven by distorted versions of reality, and we let pain determine who we are, what we do, and even what we stop living. But if Ethan and Lucas learned anything, it was this: pain does not need to become a prison. It can be a bridge. It can be a purpose. It can be a solution. And maybe this is the moment for you to stop and reflect. What have you been feeding inside? Yourself? Anger? Guilt? Silence? Or is it time to transform all of this into something bigger? Life only changes when we choose to change. When we choose the truth, even if it hurts. When we take a step, even if we are afraid. And if this story touched you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Ask yourself now, who is the Raymond in your life who may be carrying the guilt that he doesn't deserve? And if you want to continue learning from real moving stories full of wisdom, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, every week, there's a new chance to grow, get emotional, and transform along with us. Come with me on this journey, and remember, sometimes what seems like justice is just pain in disguise. But there is always time to turn the key,